So with our new config in place and working, we need to create that new folder to store our code in. So if we cd into var www.html, then we just need to make that directory that we put into our configuration file. So at the moment, we currently don't have permissions in the HTML folder, but we can use sudo to elevate our privileges to make this directory. So if we just do a sudo, then a space, and then make the directory. And that command is mk for make, dir for directory. And then what do you want to call your directory? So in the config, I did yourdomain.com. Obviously, whatever you put in your config is the folder that you need to make. Just hit enter. Now if we just do an ls, so you can see now we have yourdomain.com here. We also have that index file that we created before when we were testing. Let's remove that now. So because we don't have permissions on that, we need sudo again, and we want to rm for remove. What do we want to remove? We want to remove index.php. Hit enter. Let's just do an ls again. Now you can see the only thing in our var www.html folder is our folder for our site. In my case, yourdomain.com. So at the moment, if we just do an ls and then pass in the flags la to list these out vertically and list out all the permissions on this folder. So you can see here now, this yourdomain.com is owned by root and part of the root group. Obviously that's no good for pulling code in with our new deploy user. So we want to change ownership. So to do that, it's a sudo chown. So we want to change the ownership. And what do we want to change the ownership to? So we want to change the ownership to this current user. So we want to change it to deploy. And what group do we want to give the ownership to? Well, we want to give the ownership to data. And that's because the Nginx server is running as data. So they've got group permissions on any files in there. And then also our deploy user, we added them to the data group in the previous video. So they'll also have group permissions on it. So we want data, and then the name of the files or folders we want to change these permissions on. And while we're in var www.html, we just want to change the folder that we created just then, which in my case is yourdomain.com. Now just hit enter on this. Now if we just do an ls and pass it in the LA flags again, we can see now yourdomain.com folder is owned by deploy and it's group permissioned of data. So with the correct permissions, anyone in the data folder can read, write and execute files within there. So now we have a folder created for our project with the correct permissions and grouping. The next thing we need to do is actually pull the code down from our repository. And we created this repository in an earlier video on GitLab. So we need to give GitLab our SSH key so we can connect in and do a git pull from the repository. Now if you're using something else like GitHub or Bitbucket, they also have a similar system with deploy keys. So you can follow along with this, but obviously when you get to the UI bit where you need to input the SSH key, it's obviously going to be slightly different on your platform of choice. So the first thing we need to think about is this deploy user probably doesn't have an SSH key, and we can test that by looking in their home directory. So if we just type cd, and this is a shortcut to the current user's home directory. So we just hit enter, this will put us in deploy user's home directory. If we just do an la to list out all files and folders, we can see there's no .ssh folder in this folder list. And that's because when you create a new user, they don't have any SSH keys by default. Like in the earlier videos where we created an SSH key to connect to our repository from our local machine, we just need to do that same command and create an SSH key for this deploy user. So let's do that. So it's SSH-keygen. Then we need to pass it a T flag to tell it what type of key we want to create, and we want to create an RSA key, and then pass it the B flag for how many bytes long we want this key, and we're going to go with the maximum length of 4096. So this gives us a much more secure key, and then we can add a comment, and to do that it's a capital C, and then the comment is just something that we can help recognize the key with. So normally most people just put their email address, so I'm just going to put deploy@penguindigital.co.uk, and I'm just going to hit enter for this. Now you can see here it says created in the home directory of deploy user, and we're going to put it in the .ssh folder, and we're going to call this key pair ID_RSA. Now you can change the name of this, but ID_RSA is the default, and it's better to just leave that default unless you've got a specific reason not to. We're just going to hit enter. Now it's saying, do we want to add a password onto this key? And we're not going to add one onto this key. So we're just going to hit enter to leave it blank and then enter again. And that's the key completed. So if we just do an ls.la again, you can see now we have our .ssh folder. And if we change directory into that .ssh folder and we just do an ls.la again, we can see here now we have our private key and we have our public key. And we want to get the contents of our public key and put it into GitLab. So to do that, we can just use cat. And because we're in the same folder as the file we want to cat out, we can just pass the file name in. We don't have to put the full path in. So we can just say, I want to cat out the ID underscore, and we'll just use tab complete again. And then dot, and there we go. So we're catting out the ID underscore RSA dot pub and hit enter. And that outputs the contents of the file. So as you can see here, this is our key and it's an RSA key because we give it a type, and our comments on the end here, which we just give an email address. Let's copy the whole of this key and head over to GitLab. So over in GitLab in your repository, if you just come down to settings at the bottom here, and then we want to come to repository, and then you see here we have deploy keys. And like I said, Bitbucket and GitHub also have a similar process where you can put your keys in. So what we want to do is just paste that key in there, and then we'll give it a title as well. And this is just something for us to easily remember the key by when we check back at a later date and we're wondering what this key is. So I'm just going to call this one deploy test server. And now this checkbox gives write permissions for this deploy key. Now ideally we don't want to be pushing code from the live server back to the repository. So we're not going to select this. But just know it's an option there if for any case you do need it in the future. So without having this checked, all we can do is pull from the repository. So let's add this key, and there we go, our SSH key. So back over in our terminal. So if we cd into var /HTML, and if we just do an ls on this folder, you can see we have the folder we created before, yourdomain.com. So that is where we want to clone our project into. So as our deploy user still, we want to do a git clone. Now let's head over to our repository, and then on the home page of the repository, come to clone, and clone with SSH. We'll just get this link here, and we'll paste that in. And then as a final parameter, where do we want to clone it to? And we want to clone it into yourdomain.com. And as with any SSH connection, the first time you do it, it's going to ask you to confirm the authenticity of what you're trying to connect to. In this case, gitlab.com. We want to confirm it. And as you can see here, it's permanently added gitlab.com into our known host file, so it won't ask us that again. And also, it's cloned the project down. So if we cd into yourdomain.com and we just ls on this folder, you can see we now have our Laravel project. Now over in our browser, if we hit a refresh, we can see we get a 500 error. And that's because we haven't got Composer installed and pulled down all the packages that the application needs to run. So in the next video, let's install Composer and npm and build the project on our server.